it is a deliberate strategy to foster this kind of intense competition and try to signal to market players, this is where you need to focus your attention. This is where the government's going to put long-term support. Chinese companies, they get the signal from the policy folks. They see that this is a strategic area and they jump into the industry even if they have like no expertise. And one of my favorite examples is Tongwei, which is I think now the world's largest polysilicon maker. They originally began in aquaculture, which is like fish farming and fish food. And I keep talking about government policy, but a lot is the entrepreneurs, the companies also trying to think about, where to move to next. I think there's actually like a pretty remarkable amount of risk appetite in China's private sector for branching out into new areas.
A warm welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by Kyle Chan. Kyle is a Princeton postdoctoral researcher and adjunct at the RAND Corporation who writes the high-capacity Substack newsletter focused on China's industrial policy, technology, and economic competition. Kyle, it feels like you've sort of rocketed into celebrity status with this New York Times op-ed that came out last week, titled "In the Future, China Will Be Dominant, the U.S. Will Be Irrelevant." Strong fighting words. There's been a huge amount of reaction to this. Man, you've been getting some attention, feeling some heat. Really excited to talk about this a bit with you today. I'm just totally fascinated by political economy and what's happening in terms of this kind of great power rivalry at our doorstep. But first, tell us a little bit more about yourself. Who are you, Kyle Chan?
Really great to be here. I am a postdoctoral researcher right now at Princeton. I also work with the RAND Corporation. I started sort of doing fieldwork on China and India during my PhD at Princeton in sociology. That really was focused actually in the early days more on infrastructure than industrial policy. I was looking at railway development, high-speed rail. It's funny, I try to convince Americans to care about like rail infrastructure. Yeah, and I'm actually from California, born and raised in LA. So I was always like, why does it suck to just drive and be stuck in traffic all the time? Is there another way? And yeah, traveling around the world give me a chance to see there actually is an alternative.
I mean, 100 plus years ago, America used to kick ass at building railroads, right?
That's
not
true.
High speed, but
I mean, a lot of the story is not a puzzle about China or India. It's a puzzle about the US, but that's something we can come back to. Yeah, so I was like really interested, China's built out this high-speed rail system that is now larger than all the other bullet train systems in the world combined, including the Japan Shinkansen. India actually has a very well-developed rail system too. And I was just trying to understand the role of the government in all this. And I started to realize that industrial policy is actually a huge area that has a lot of the same dynamics, a lot of the same structures, a lot of the same actors, government, private firms, local, central government, stuff like that. So I started to shift more into clean tech, EVs, batteries, trying to understand how China has become so dominant in a lot of these industries that are so important and are high tech and are seen as sort of like the industries of the future. Then switching over into the Substack with high capacity and just being active in trying to get some of this research out there, like this sort of understanding of how China's system works to a more general audience. I think I was surprised by how limited the understanding of China is, honestly, in DC. I've always been like in the academic world up until now, and I've been surrounded by people who read and speak Mandarin and do this full time. So it was sort of like quite a shock to step back and realize like, oh, there's actually a lot of basic stuff here that I would like to try to help shed light on. So yeah, so now I'm more focused on sort of policy issues, current, a lot of these, the trade war, the tech war between the US and China, Chinese industrial policy, working on a book as well. But that's sort of the trajectory up until now.
Yeah, no, I'm very excited to dig into some of what you've identified there. Like what I find fascinating is the structural advantages, the demographic advantages that the U.S. has. I mean, geographically, my God, like this is the promised land. You've got, friendly neighbors, maybe not friendly to them, but they don't pose a big threat. You've got big coastlines, deep harbors. You've got this incredible internal waterway that basically unites, 80% of the continental U.S. Navigable. You've got oil, you've got energy, you've got, minerals. You've got it all, right? And I mean, China's this enduring civilization, 4,000 years old. It's got some geographic attributes, or attributes, I should say, but probably not as favorable as the U.S. And as you're saying, I think most of us who are not in your world and not as tied in have this out of date notion of sort of what China is, where it's at. We're probably 5-10 years behind, and a lot has changed in the interim. So, in terms of this core essay, maybe you could just kind of outline what the thesis is.
Yeah, the headline is actually not of my choosing. So that was the fine editors at the Times. But the piece is mine, and the argument I'm trying to make is I'm trying to do a wake up call, basically. I'm trying to say as much about the U.S. perhaps as I am about China. Basically, China is trying to forge ahead on a whole host of industries that it is currently dominant in, that it wants to be dominant in, that it wants to be a global leader in. So that, I mentioned already, China's a manufacturing superpower, makes more than anyone, makes more than the rest of the world combined in areas like, so I mentioned steel, aluminum, cement, sort of, the old sort of industrial goods, as well as more high tech stuff, EVs, batteries, drones, also shipbuilding. I mean, the list goes on, and you can see it in the piece itself. But I try to argue that China's not stopping there. It's 2025 now. Back in 2015, China had the Made in China 2025 plan, which got a lot of attention. Ironically, that's like not the most important document, or it's one of many documents and one of many plans, part of like a broader industrial policy strategy in China. But that's one that I think got a lot of the world's attention, and I would say that program to try to use industrial policy to accelerate China's progress in a number of industries, that hasn't ended with the year 2025. It's only growing further. China's investing in science and research, universities, public research institutes, as well as private investment in its now famous tech firms. So there's a whole host of areas, and we can get into also some of the ones that China's targeting for the future: AI, robotics. These are really, really big areas of focus for industrial policy. At the same time, I just felt like I had to say something about what was happening in the U.S., especially with this split screen with what's happening in China, where the U.S. was just shooting itself in the foot in every way. The piece paints a bleak picture of what the future could look like, and I just wanted to kind of extrapolate the past few months forward in time. So things like Trump's attacks on public research, cutting NIH, NSF funding, attacking American universities, cracking down on immigration and scaring away foreign talent, the very foreign talent that made the entire country,
Made America great.
Made America great in the first place. So, yeah, I just saw that, okay, if this is what just a few months could do, the damage could be really, really long-term and really severe. So that's why I wanted to paint this picture to really sort of like wake up Americans in particular, and maybe the rest of the world too, to just like what could happen, what the stakes really are, and the fact that as bad as things seem now, the real consequences, again, like cutting investment in science and research, the real long-term consequences will take place a decade, 2 decades from now, when that pipeline that we would have had of innovation runs dry. So that's sort of the picture I was painting. China on the one hand, like really valuing science and technology. Like there's also a cultural element to this where it's like very highly prized, not just at the government, but society wide. And in the U.S., this sort of like a sort of self-destruction of a lot of the pillars. I call them the pillars of American power, the things that really underpin American success for at least the past century.
You're aware of Peter Zeihan? Are you aware of him?
Yeah.
He's constantly predicting Chinese collapse within 5 or 10 years. He's extremely confident in his predictions. He has some interesting things to say again regarding demographics. Again, looking at sort of geographic determinism. He's a China doomer on the perspective of like, okay, look, this is the most trade dependent nation in the world. They import a lot of their energy. Obviously, a big reason to become the electro state and do EVs and electrify as much as possible is to deal with being the world's largest oil importer. But they also are very dependent on imported agricultural goods. Their demography is shit. I mean, that's not unique, but it's particularly challenging in China. It's all gonna, and they have, a what are we going to call it? Like a political, operating system based on Marxist-Leninism, not the best system in terms of, succession, and there's lots of trials and tribulations there. And he says, it is, for all of America's problems, geographically just well endowed for the reasons we went over before. That being said, like North America was geographically well endowed prior to the Columbian Exchange and prior to Europeans coming over, but the difference in part was technology, right? And just a step change difference in the technology of the colonizer, shall we say. And so this is a sort of long, circuitous, maybe intro to the next question, but let's accept that China is disadvantaged currently compared to America in terms of geography and demographics. This investment in technology, this strategic coordination, choreography of state-owned enterprises, of private players harnessing entrepreneurship, but also providing all of the supporting infrastructure for strategic industries. You have a number of playing cards, and maybe China's demographics and geography are sort of weak, but they are, I think, really trying to make up for that and deal maybe with the demographic collapse with, installing the most industrial robots in the world and dealing with maybe an incoming labor crisis. So talk a little bit, I guess, about the Chinese, the PRC's focus now on dominating in terms of, say, manufacturing. And again, just how relevant the high technologies that are starting to emerge as important. Like, look no further than Ukraine and Operation Spiderweb and going, holy shit, drones are really important. Well, batteries are really important for drones. Who's really, drilling down on that? And, I hear about like American defense contractors that, they build drones in the US, but they're completely, dependent on Chinese supply chains, and even, not just for rare earths and things, but for parts for these drones. Like it's crazy. So anyway, I have a tendency to
this is great.
These preposterously long questions, but fire on all cylinders, hit back.
Yeah. So the funny thing is, all the headwinds that people like Peter Zion are pointing out are real, and I actually point them out in that New York Times piece as well. Demography is a huge problem. I mean, you have a shrinking workforce, an aging population. You have resource constraints, where China has always been sort of energy insecure, always worried about access to oil and gas, always, trying to figure out, like, by any means necessary, like investing in nuclear, in the grid, in renewables. I mean, this is all driven in very large part by this energy insecurity and, dependence on trade. I mean, yeah, that's absolutely true. So while there are these major headwinds on top of what's right now sort of an economic slowdown in China with the real estate bust, all these things are true, and I think they're all the more reason for why the government is pushing for industrial policy and trying to move up the value chain, move into these high-tech industries to promote things like automation and robotics and things like that. So yeah, take the demography thing, for example. So that's one area where I think the folks in Beijing see the writing on the wall. They realize that this will be a greater and greater issue over time, that, as you point out, it's not just China facing this problem, right? A lot of countries, a lot of industrialized nations, a lot of countries, especially in Northeast Asia, are facing similar challenges. Japan and South Korea being probably the top ones. And the question is, like, what to do about it. And actually, there's a parallel here with Japan, because Japan's approach has also been to sort of embrace robotics as sort of one pathway. And what's happening in China is, I think, almost what I would call like a creative destruction approach. So I think for a long time, jobs had been of paramount importance, not too dissimilar to a democracy where, you want to win over voters and you want to give them jobs and things like, and economic growth. What has changed, though, is I think that China's really pushing forward on automation, trying to maintain and grow productivity in the face of some of these headwinds. So with a declining workforce, with an aging population, trying to figure out how to sustain. I don't think they're going to keep up the double-digit growths of past decades, but how to keep growing the economy and especially how to keep sort of moving up the value chain. So that's one area. Another area that I think the sort of weaknesses turn into a kind of strength or at least a motivating factor is, again, the energy security factor. And again, this is actually a Northeast Asia story. You have a bunch of countries there where you just don't have access to oil, and has always been an issue in that region. The U.S., I would argue, has almost a resource curse when it comes to making the transition to renewables, where it seems sort of too easy and too attractive to just kind of hang out in oil and gas world. And so that's one area where I think some of the perceived vulnerabilities might end up turning into impetus for change. Now, when it comes to how China is trying to build up these sort of pillars of manufacturing, I think I see this as sort of a long-term process that's been going on now for decades. So, we're kind of stepping in, I think, for some people, seeing like the rise of Chinese EVs, BYD with its, incredible range of models at very, very competitive price points now, appearing in markets all over the world, except for the US. Like this is a moment that I think is kind of the tip of the iceberg for a lot of things, in terms of a bunch of trends that have been going on for a while. So you have the development, and I think you had Patrick McGee on recently.
Haven't we all?
Yeah, haven't we all? I mean, I actually just interviewed him.
The guy's killing it.
He is. I was like, who is your publicist, by the way?
Right. He's like Donald Trump.
Can't beat that. So, but like his book shows the role of not just Apple, but the entire sort of smartphone and consumer electronics industry in China. You have China deliberately trying to build up not just sort of final assembly capabilities, but sort of all the electronic components that go into smartphones, which includes lithium batteries. And so a lot of the Chinese battery giants today, the ones who are building batteries for EVs and that make Chinese EVs so competitive, they got their start, BYD, CATL, in consumer electronics batteries, and discovered, hey, we're pretty good at this. And there's a much potentially bigger market in EVs. And they made the switch over. And so there's a lot of sort of synergies and crossovers between all these industries. And I think a key thing to understand about what is happening in China is that it's not like a single area where China happens to be, building up its manufacturing capabilities. It's not just shipbuilding. It's not just aerospace. It's not just, EVs. It's across this full range, and it creates this sort of ecosystem that feeds onto itself, that's sort of like mutually reinforcing, where you get better at batteries, you get better at sensors, LiDAR, radar, ultrasonic sensors, cameras. I mean, again, from the smartphone world, they go into the EV and even the AV world, autonomous vehicle world. So you see all these sort of interlinking connections between these industries. And I think that's what China's trying to build up with this very strong focus on, hard tech industries, physical manufacturing, industrial automation, things like that. And so that's why I think things like robotics almost spring naturally from that foundation that exists. You're talking about electric drives, electric motors, actuators, even certain kinds of joints, mechanical joints already being made in China for other industries now can be funneled into some of these new, emerging sectors. So yeah, just to see how this whole ecosystem works together and sort of builds on each other, it comes back to this question of like, why can't the US do that? Why can't we build iPhones here? And I guess we could, it's like at what price? But a lot of the ecosystem, it's not just about, this one sector or this one product. It's about the whole sort of universe of interlocking suppliers and goods that feed into that. So I think that's something that China's been investing on for a long time. And I think they're betting that this will sort of like continue to snowball and deepen China's advantages in these areas.
Yeah, so, I mean, we're framing this as sort of government decisions, but this is part of a broader political economy. And I've never been satisfied with like words that just, you need adjectives in front of a lot of words like capitalism, right? I mean, I mentioned sort of Gilded Age capitalism, entrepreneurial capitalism, We have, I guess, developmentalist capitalism. We have state capitalism. Maybe that's kind of how we could describe China. We have sort of financialized capitalism now in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
I've been sort of wrestling with a lot of these adjectives and trying to sort of come up with the best sort of dichotomy to help illustrate, I guess, the points in your essays, that split screen that you're describing. And what I came up with was stock buyback capitalism, like super financialized capitalism, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like, we're not actually investing in R&D, we're not actually investing in production, we're just returning value to the shareholder,
Mm-hmm.
right? Financialized US style capitalism of the last 20, 30 years. I learned recently that stock buybacks were like illegal and considered stock manipulation until the 80s. But now it's a very, very common thing. And according to Pat McGee, this is how Apple is actually going to invest its $500 billion
Oh yeah.
in the US, generating only 20,000 jobs. Well, how does it do that? It's going to return a lot of value to the shareholder, a lot of them being Americans. Okay, so that's my American adjective, stock buyback capitalism. What I have for China is involution capitalism.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And I would love it if, I'm just starting to gain a little bit of literacy in that concept. But I think I've done a decent job of explaining the stock buyback thing, and people are a bit aware of, how we've switched capitalisms perhaps to move really towards a more financialized political economy in the US. So probably best use of our time for you to delve into this idea of like involution. Like, what the hell is it? What are the objectives? How is it sort of maintained, et cetera? But first off, involution. Maybe you can even say the word in Mandarin. I just think it's cool.
Nadrin. Yeah. So it's a funny term. I think it captures both the structural strengths and weaknesses of China's approach to doing this kind of industrial policy. So like it means this sort of almost race to the bottom, a kind of intense, fierce competition to the point where you are starting to reach the point of diminishing marginal returns, and things might not actually be getting better. You feel like you're putting in more work, more effort, and the term has been it's widely used in sort of the economics world now and business world to describe like the kind of intense business competition, but it's also used to describe sort of a personal feeling of like, as a worker, I'm putting in the hours, I'm doing, in China, the tech firms are famous or notorious for having this sort of 996 from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week work culture. And some of them are even, sort of more brutal, like Huawei. And the idea is like, wait, I'm putting in more hours, I'm working even harder, and I feel like I'm not going anywhere. I'm not gaining from that. And so anyways, apparently the term is not Chinese originally. It's a translation of the English word that Clifford Geertz used, I think. I need to check the source on that. But when I read that, I was like, wow, that kind of makes sense because it sounds strange in Chinese. So yeah, but what it means in the sort of like industrial economics world is this very sort of intense competition. There used to be other terms like vicious competition, over competition in China, where you have, say, an industry like solar panels, pick EVs now today, even offshore wind, areas where you have a bunch of players, maybe they're private, maybe they're state-owned, but they're all really pouring energy and investment into ramping up production and to building up scale and trying to gain market share. And part of that might involve a price war. So right now, the EV industry in China is going through like its umpteenth price war, this time triggered by another move by BYD. And the downside of all this is that this might damage the industry long term. It might hurt profitability to the point where companies don't have enough to reinvest back into R&D to have sort of more long-term sustainable growth. There's also concerns that, this is sort of wasteful use of capital. So there are all sorts, and then there's a whole international dimension to this that we could come back to if you want. But those are the downsides, the fear, and this is a very genuine concern among Beijing policymakers that they don't want to see an industry kind of extinguish itself because it had a brutal price war, and then everyone went into debt and then couldn't come out of it. Now, the plus side of all this is that this intense competition generates a lot of innovation. It generates a lot of innovation in features, in sort of like the final product, but also in efficiency, in trying to drive greater productivity. And so that's why, in areas where this has worked out, you have basically a really sort of intense battle within China for like, and maybe 100 players. This is what's happening now in the EV industry. Maybe 100 players are there in the scrum in the beginning, and then over time there might be just a handful left. And those handful that survive this whole process, they will go on to probably do very well in the global marketplace, competing against international players. And so it's sort of this tournament model where it's like you win if you can win in China, you can win anywhere. That's the thinking there.
I've been wanting to ask someone this question for a while now. I focus a lot on this podcast on nuclear energy, and obviously the Chinese are becoming sort of the dominant, most capable nation state to leverage these clustered heavy industry ecosystems to deliver nuclear energy, and they have a strategic imperative to do so because they're not swimming in natural gas cheaper than water as you guys are down in the U.S. But I'm wondering if and so what I kind of say is state capitalism. You kind of need significant involvement of the state and coordination to really have nuclear liftoff, as the French did under kind of de regisme capitalism. If I want to add another adjective, or various Soviet Union or other nations that have or even just social democracies, right? Which identified an energy imperative and marshaled state resources to get the nuclear train rolling. I think of renewables as sort of bicycles and skateboards that are, lower risk construction projects, easier to get moving. But if you really want to stand up a nuclear industry that's competent, my God, it takes a lot of coordination. China's able to do that. I'm getting a little long-winded here. Do you think that the price decreases in polysilicon, in solar panels, in wind turbines, in grid firming batteries, like we've seen just most insane dramatic price downs in these products, one after the other, and a bunch of that has to do with improvements in the technology. But how much of it do you think has to do with this zero margin race to the bottom involution capitalism? Like, do you think these products would have got so cheap without China, without involution capitalism?
Yeah, so I think it's a crucial element to the whole mix. I think it is this intense competition. It is this sort of really, really like. I mean, the term race, like industry race, is like used a lot in China. And I don't think you would have gotten, the per kilowatt hour price of batteries dropping so rapidly, or the price of solar dropping so rapidly, unless you had this sort of intense competition. Of course, there's a balance here. There needs to be enough for industry players to see sort of a long-term payoff at the end of the day in China, and part of that is the government stepping in to do what the market can't. The government saying, okay, for solar, we are going to be your biggest buyer, or we're going to incentivize local governments to be your biggest buyers. We're going to roll out solar energy at a scale that is just unprecedented, and we're going to do that with Chinese-produced solar panels, Chinese-produced solar cells. And so you get this sort of like a feedback loop where then that causes industry players to say, hey, this is going to be a really good long-term bet. I'm going to make the investment, even if, just sort of pure market forces might not tell you that that's always the best thing. There's sort of like this threshold or equilibrium, shift that you need to do to get to that point where you can have sort of that self-sustaining, solar industry, for example. And so I think, I think back, to the industries that you point out are such great ones, nuclear, battery investment, even some of the less like sexy ones like shipbuilding is and steel. They seem like from another world, but they're still so relevant. They're key inputs actually, ironically, into clean energy. Shipbuilding, building wind turbine installation vessels is really, really important. It turns out actually absolutely essential for doing offshore wind, and so. Like making that investment and getting over the hump for, it's not just about a single firm finding a path to profitability in the next year or two. It's about having a whole industry take off and be able to fly on its own. And that's the other thing to all this. I don't think that the folks in Beijing want these policies to be long-term sort of crutches for industry players. So it's a dynamic process where they might begin with even some protection, with a degree of protectionism, trying to insulate infant industries from more competitive global players in the early days, providing sort of that early support, but then the idea is to back away and let these industries take flight. And so that's what you see happen again and again, where ultimately the goal is sort of long-term competitiveness, and all of that plays a role. The sort of internal market competition, the government sort of dynamic policies trying to incentivize investment today, but then not incentivize being dependent on the government in the long term. I think these are all the sort of elements that combine together to produce what we see now.
So, involution, you said, has benefits, has risks, and there is the potential to sort of stagnate on the innovation side, maybe as you just try and suppress prices and maximize, number of units, for instance, to again, just drive down costs. And maybe all you're getting is an extra karaoke system and not a revolution in better, faster charging battery. But we are seeing these better, faster charging batteries.
Yes.
So it's in combination with state policies, which are, really focused, as you said, made in China 2015, on winning the innovation race. Just quickly, if it's possible, and I love this banter, I'm really enjoying this. Who is enforcing or encouraging this involution onto these companies? Is it an artifact of this hybrid sort of state capitalism? Like, you imagine that corporate champions in America would not respond well to, like, hey guys, the new paradigm is involution. Fuck your profit margins and produce. What's different about China in that way?
Yeah. I think definitely for these target industries where you see this involution happening, it is almost a deliberate strategy to foster this kind of intense competition and try to signal to market players, this is where you need to focus your attention. This is where the government's going to put long-term support. And, China's, as a sort of national strategic imperative, needs to develop these industries. So I think that's where a lot of it's coming from. The dynamics then themselves emerge from these sort of structural factors that are produced by the combination of policy, having this huge market, the local governments each trying to support their own local champions. So it's sort of like an emergent feature of this broader system. But the overall sort of trajectory is one where, you might have this whole cycle where you have like suddenly every player is jumping in. For example, I like to point out like funny cases where Chinese companies, they get the signal from the policy folks, they see that this is a strategic area, and they jump into the industry even if they have like no expertise. And one of my favorite examples is Tongwei, which is the I think now the world's largest polysilicon maker. They originally began in aquaculture, which is like fish farming and fish food. And I think there were some policies, and there was definitely demand for polysilicon in China when this company was looking at the landscape and decided to make that bold move and jump into this industry. Also seeing that it would have policy support, that the government wanted to build up solar in general. So that's an example where, you can see this connection between the signal from, central government or local governments and the decision-making by private entrepreneurs who are thinking, I do fish food and not solar panels. My favorite is now Tongwei even has products where they can do like a fish farm plus solar panels laid on top. It's like the ultimate synergy. But yeah, it's like, a lot, I keep talking about government policy, but a lot is the entrepreneurs, the companies themselves also trying to think about, where to move to next, taking that big risk. And I think there's actually like a pretty remarkable amount of risk appetite in China's private sector for branching out into new areas. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioning solar again, I can't stress this enough, and maybe I'm off in my thinking, but again, within China can build nuclear exceptionally well. Crazy good schedules, staying on budgets, low installed kilowatt cost. The West definitely can't. I'm not sure that the West would be able to install solar and wind as cheaply and economically without China having practiced involution capitalism and driven down the price. But I've already kind of beaten that dead horse. So we don't no need to kind of comment on that again. I had a question though as well about the purchasing power, not necessarily of the dollar and the yuan, but this was fascinating. Obviously, like the CPI inflation metrics, they're missing a big part of the picture in terms of what the dollar could purchase in the 40s versus now. And Pat McGee talked about the Marshall, like basically Apple doing kind of double the Marshall Plan for Europe post-war in terms of its investment, something like 50 plus billion per year, the same amount that the Biden administration spent as a sort of historic investment in the CHIPS Act. Well, Apple put that in as investments into China every year for 5 years. But what does that dollar buy? So the example I like from the nuclear world is the inflation-adjusted and probably 2015 dollars value or investment into the entire Manhattan project was $30 billion, $30 billion. Vogtle, the most recent and really only new nuclear reactors built in the U.S. in the 21st century, cost $35 billion. How could two standardized pressurized water reactors cost more than the entire Manhattan project? Obviously, the inflation index is missing something in terms of purchasing power. I just got back from a trip to Berlin, learned about the Hobrecht plan, where Berlin's population went from 300,000 to 2 or 3 million in like 50, 60 years. China's in those kind of moments. And it strikes me that the purchasing power of, if we want to just kind of blur out the difference between the currencies, is just so much greater in China in terms of what can be bought with, whatever, a similar exchange rated piece of currency. I'm not sure if you can or want to comment on that.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think it gets at something, that I find comparisons between, like, say, the two economies, the U.S. and Chinese economy, often get kind of conflated with a whole bunch of other factors like inflation, like the purchasing power parity, like the sort of like real cost of goods and real cost of living in the two countries. And I mean, I think that what I'm interested in is ultimately, like, what is the real impact on what you're able to produce, what you're able to enjoy in your quality of life. And I think, the funny thing is, like, on paper, it looks like the U.S. might be producing more stuff, like has a larger GDP on a nominal basis, at least, things like that. But I think we forget about looking at sort of like real output, like concrete, like products, services, access to healthcare, like educate. These are sort of like the ultimate ends, right? There's like I'm sure whole a
Human
Marxist.
Development Index.
Yeah. I mean, there's like a whole Marx thing here where it's like, okay, it's not about the money itself. The money is a means to an end, but somehow the whole thing got reversed, and the money became the end in and of itself. And I that comparison with the Manhattan Project versus the cost of a new nuclear reactor in the U.S. today is like so striking and so telling. And I think that's something that, again, if you look at the Chinese economy overall, you might see that they are starting to slow from the double digit growth rates of the 90s, 2000s, and even recently you have this like, I think it was like a year or two where the US, like, actual sort of GDP growth was like higher than China's, like maybe 1 year or something after COVID. And I think that obscures something else that's happening, which is just that access to, like, a lot of the basics in China has gotten much more affordable in this same period of time. Other things have gotten less affordable. So the real estate problem is definitely a big one and a growing one. But this idea that, like, okay, you look at the top line numbers and they don't tell you the whole story. In fact, you might look at China's share of manufacturing, for example, over time, and that has been growing much more rapidly. Where you look at sort of like movements up in the technology value chain, and that's something that I think matters a lot more in terms of sort of long term what you can do with your life than sort of like these sort of not quite apples to apples comparisons of like GDP and currency values and stuff like that.
Yeah, you mentioned your description there of moving up the value chain. There's I mean, two things. They both come out of Australia. One is I don't know if it comes out of Australia, but it's an Australian example. An economic complexity indicator by country, right? And I've gone to Australia the last few years giving some speeches, and something I always harp on is they've essentially become this dig and ship mineral version of a mineral state, which supports, a service economy. Educational institutions are a big driver. Coffee, amazing coffee. But, they've dropped in terms of that scale from being maybe the 24th country in the world down to the 73rd between Uganda and Pakistan, like bounded by Uganda and Pakistan, because their economies become so much less complex. That's paralleled by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute tracking, I think 64 critical technologies. China led in 3 of them in like 2010, in over 40 of them in 2023, and in over 50 of them in 2024, and at risk of Chinese monopoly in 24 of them. And I mean, it feels like we're just into, this, we're not into this, the S curve part of this, high technology prioritization and, I don't call it leapfrogging necessarily, but into that exponential value add and moving into high technology. Part of involution is just producing insane amounts. There's definitely allegations of unfair trading practices, currency suppression, but also, state support for industries to develop that monopoly status. China, again, I'm grossly underinformed, but, the Middle Kingdom is not interested in sort of imperial conquest, but, pretty okay with sort of flooding the world market and putting the European and American solar industry out of business.
Right.
And probably more broadly, that seems like a rationale for involution. So again, I don't even know if that's a question, but feel free to comment.
Yeah. No, okay. So on the economic complexity thing, I love this topic. I mean, I really think, again, thinking about different ways of understanding how an economy, how a society works beyond, again, sort of like the simple top line numbers that we're used to thinking about. Like I think it was maybe Ricardo Hausman at MIT and some other folks also who were part of this project, just trying to understand, like not just how big is the economy, but like how complex, how much of the high tech components are you actually making yourself, and how dependent are you on other countries for that? And it comes back to what you were saying about sort of financialized capital in the U.S., right? It's like, okay, if not insignificant share of your economy is like Wall Street, hedge funds like trading with each other and selling services
20%, I believe, of the economy.
It's actually pretty big.
Yeah.
Like selling stuff to each other, I don't know what the social value add there is in many cases. High frequency traders buying like better fiber optic cables to trade, faster. Like I don't know what that produces exactly, but I do know that if you are able to make high quality commercial jets, that provides a lot of value to people who need to travel, or again, to come back to climate. I mean, if you're able to produce, again, not just cheap EVs, but ones that have megawatt charging, which is like BYD, actually a number of Chinese EV makers are announcing sort of these capabilities, to the point where charging an EV takes about as much time as it does to fill up pump gas at the gas station. Like that is a game changer. So in terms of like people's real lives, in terms of climate impact, in terms of sort of like real world things. So that's something that I've been paying attention to a lot of, because you might feel like, and this is for the American perspective too, I'm like, Americans might feel secure being number one because zooming out things look fine, but when you zoom in on like what actually constitutes, what are we making, what are we producing, what are we providing for each other, that's a part where I think it's very interesting to kind of drill down. And I think from the Chinese side, I think that there are definitely issues here with some of the, there's also involution issues with education, for example, in terms of quality of life, and people just being very, very stressed about the Gaokao, which is the college entrance exam, and how huge a stake that plays, how huge a role that plays in people's lives. So there's areas that I don't think get captured in sort of traditional valuation metrics that affect how people feel on a day-to-day basis and go about their lives. So those are some examples of like, positive and negative things that can show up if you look at some of these same issues in a different perspective.
Right. Well, maybe let's put the microscope over onto the U.S. Side, political economy, Trump's goals. It's really hard with, in my opinion, such a kind of toxic, repulsive human being. But sympathizing with some of the objectives, right? Like, yes, let's dust some rust off the Rust Belt. Let's build things in America again. Like this is getting a bit ridiculous, guys, that, we're so locked out of, or potentially locked out of, a rare earth export control from China could be devastating for, not just the U.S. defense sector, but lots of other, little magnets that make windows go up and down in your vehicles or whatever else, right? Like
Yeah.
we have I love trying to understand how the sausage gets made and how supply chains work, and that was kind of hard enough in like 1950s supply chains. Nowadays, it's absolutely ridiculous. But let's say that we sympathize with that objective of not reshoring everything, making Nike shoes, like those Chinese AI generated spoof videos of sort of fat fingered Americans trying to sew together Chinese shoes in a dismal factory condition. It's challenging, right? Because of this involution, because these Chinese corporations are implicitly or explicitly chasing monopoly with involution, with like razor thin margins. What kind of industrial policy? Because your essay is not. I mean, I think it's like offended a lot of people that maybe didn't read it carefully, or question your motives, or just don't like being faced with the kind of reality that you're forcing them to look at. And I know it wasn't you didn't choose the title for the NYT Op-Ed, but all that being said, you are, I think, someone who's concerned about what's happening to America, and like what's your recipe? Because this is one hell of a challenge. Your argument seems to be that despite Trump's goals, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The implementation is maybe doing the opposite.
Yeah. So that op-ed, you only get so much room to say what you want to say.
I know.
There's a whole part about like what should we do, where I was like, all right, I'll just squeeze in a few sentences at the end. But yeah, I mean, so I agree with you. The funny thing is, I think Trump has the correct hunch for some things, like the idea that we should be so dependent on manufacturing in other countries, and that we could just sort of outsource it all. I think he's right to be critical of that. I think also trying to figure out ways to streamline parts of the bureaucracy. This is sort of like I can see, as much as sort of Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson might hate this. I could see some overlap between the goals of the abundance agenda and the sort of like Doge agenda. It's just about how you do it. So I would not recommend the way that the Trump administration has been going about it. But one thing that I would try to pitch to Americans is, and I think there's growing interest in this, is to take industrial policy seriously, to do it in a careful and deliberative manner, to think about the full range of policy tools that can be used. So I would say that even tariffs have a role to play here. If you apply them selectively, time it right, sequence it properly. Let's say you want to bring a battery industry to the United States. You might not be able to produce synthetic graphite at a price that's competitive yet. You might not be able to, process lithium and do sort of all the components immediately. You might still rely on that from other countries, including China, perhaps. But you might start to build the capabilities for some of the downstream segments of the value chain, and then eventually start to move up over time. And tariffs could help you, protect some parts. And then when those are ready, when those subsectors are mature, then you can sort of move the tariffs off of those and maybe onto other areas. So that's one example. Other examples are there ways that we could, I think this is already happening, figure out how to streamline some of the permitting process. I mean, these are probably topics that you think about all the time. And I think probably most of all, though, is a realization that there are things we just can't leave totally up to the market. That I think for some things like toys, personal electronics, small things, that's fine. In fact, probably many things we can it's debatable whether a government invention is more helpful or harmful. But I would argue there are certain parts of the economy that are strategically important, that have either huge downstream impacts on the rest of the economy. And so semiconductors is exactly one of those areas where, like if you have a chip shortage, as we saw during COVID, then that impacts your entire auto industry could be frozen. And that has downstream consequences. All the communities that rely on auto worker jobs get impacted. There's also obviously all the other major important issues like climate and national security that don't get priced in, that don't get factored into the profit forecast for companies. They're focused on the bottom line, and there's a lot of effects that extend far beyond the choices that they make. And so in those areas, I would argue that we need to have like real, sustained, persistent industrial policy aimed at developing those industries in the United States, in particular, but also in coordination with, the phrase now I feel like is starting to have a hollow ring to it, but allies and partners. It's kind of hard to call them allies and partners when you're tariffing them and trying to crush their economies, or even trying to
them.
yeah, or annexing them. So I do realize the the sort of contradictions here, but yeah, ideally, you sort of form this more robust, more resilient nexus of supply chains and industries that create basically real sort of long-term value, whether that's insulating an economy from potential global shocks, or whether that's pushing ahead on areas that the market really does very poorly at, like addressing climate. So these are areas where I see that there were some of the seeds were planted with the Biden administration, with earlier administrations, Obama as well. It goes back even further than that. I see that what we have though from the legacy of those administrations are sort of just the small pieces that we need to really build up onto. And I realize I'm speaking in the age of Trump too, and so it's like, who's going to listen to this argument now? But I actually would even argue that there's sort of like a strain with the Republican Party that also is concerned about critical minerals, energy security, thinking about even batteries. I try to argue, to anyone who will listen to me, that batteries are not just a clean tech thing. Let's say you don't care about climate. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people who probably are like that in the US. They matter for drones. They matter for robots. They matter for potentially defense industries. They matter for just the plain old auto industry. So there are reasons to want to invest and to do so in a way that goes above and beyond, what we sort of hope and pray our, corporations will end up doing on our behalf. So that's sort of my broader message.
It was really funny. I live in Ontario. One of our big pitches to America, and actually we're going to see, I think, a major trade deal with Canada, with the U.S., with Canada saying you have the sort of right of first access to our minerals in terms of investments, and it's going to be a really interesting kink in our trade thing. But in Ontario, we have some big critical mineral deposits, and the advertisements, like a week after Trump was elected, they were trying to preempt this trade war, shifted from what you would expect in terms of we have rare earths and critical minerals. Under the Biden administration, it would have been the political ad would have had solar panels and wind turbines. In the Trump era, it was military tech, right? Like missile defense systems, and you need our I don't know which rare earth element it was. Okay, so getting to this question of interesting, you were mentioning sort of Ezra and Derek. Obviously, it's again with so much with Trump, it's not the intention, but it's the delivery. I would posit, if they haven't already, a Department of Government efficacy rather
I like
than
that.
efficiency, right?
Yeah.
But there's this allergy, like in the nuclear world, we say, nuclear is fucked in the West or in America because the Democrats love nuclear, they hate government. Sorry, Republicans love nuclear, hate government, and Democrats love government but hate nuclear. That's changed. There's this cool consensus emerging now. But the kind of government the Democrats seem to be leaning into or have adopted is kind of a managerial government that sort of facilitates rent extraction and collaborates quite nicely with financial capital, franchised capitalism. Not the previous sort of developmentalist capitalism of the New Deal, which I think locked in a generation of sort of Democrat dominance. So talk about that challenge. You're a graduate of the Chicago School of Economics.
Yeah,
This is the
that's right.
homeland of Milton Friedman, the Chicago boys. Where it all kicked off. I don't know where all it kicked off, but major impacts on the Chilean laboratory of cutthroat
Chicago
neoliberalism.
boys. Right.
Yeah. I think Maggie Thatcher might have entertained Milton Friedman. There's a few Milton Friedman quotes I love. But yeah, talk about that sort of allergy to government and as you mentioned, it's essay, and how I sort of started off this conversation is what it feels like is we are the Soviets now in terms of having potentially an inferior political economy that's going to lead to shittier manufactured goods and just not being competitive at making the critical things that we need as a society. And as the Soviets did, they kept up in space to a degree. They kept up in defense to a degree. Maybe we can pull that off. But in terms of the health of our broader society, our current economic model's not working. And I think that has a lot to do with the stories, the narratives that we tell ourselves, which are grounded in, again, I think romantic ideas around, these Ayn Rand heroes, Carnegie, Rockefeller, these magnates of industry who are just being held back by government. Just unleash that, get rid of, all of the regulations, and, the next century will be American, or this century will be American. Okay. Take it away from there.
Yeah. It's so funny because I do think there's such a deep sort of cultural embeddedness to all this like focus on the celebrity entrepreneur, the lone genius who, if only society can get out of, his or her way, or if only the government can just, step aside, then suddenly we unleash, these great entrepreneurial forces and, reach AGI or something like that. Then the reality is not quite like that. So yeah, I just think that one thing I kind of hint at the piece, but that I talk about, in other sort of spaces, is just like the boring parts of government, for example, the civil service, like good regulation, and there's a lot of bad regulation too, but like how much of that, what I call like societal infrastructure, institutional infrastructure, that we just take for granted, that we just we sort of ignore the investments made into mRNA vaccines or something like that, or ignore sort of like all the other sort of behind the scenes factors, and we focus on like the one Elon Musk who like can take us to Mars. And it's just like, that's not how the world works. Even you take like Tesla and SpaceX. I mean, they're huge organizations full of like really incredible engineers and workers and managers. So like the story is much more complicated, and I think it doesn't help that we have this sort of dominant image. And I think also another thing is, this sort of contrast between like the market, like almost sort of like the term is often used, like a market fundamentalism, like the market will naturally solve all our problems for us. And I think, to be fair, like Adam Smith had a great insight that there are some emerging properties that I don't think we might have appreciated fully had we sort of recognized that, oh, okay, so like some of these sort of voluntary free transactions can be mutually beneficial and can add up to a lot. I think what we forget is, the role of how power can want to reinforce itself, how when you get some companies that are powerful enough, they will want to bend the rules for their own sake, that the so-called market never fully existed in its freest form, and there have always been interests trying to distort it, change it, bend it to its own will. And I think this is especially now important in the age of both growing competition between the US and China, and in the age of climate change. I think that these things really sort of give lie to the idea that like, oh, the market will just handle it if we just take a step back. I think we see now, like with growing severity, the gap between what the market is capable or willing of doing and what we actually need to do in order to address some of these problems. So that's why I see that, maybe the irony is that some people who are worried about competition with China, maybe they'll be more worried about other sort of like big existential things, maybe even like climate change, and vice versa. I think that these are bigger issues that transcend like the share buyback world of like, oh, is it going to be what's the CEO compensation this year? There's a lot more that's happening that needs to be addressed. Yeah.
Right. Okay, I have not thought this out well at all, but I'm going back to sort of Gilded Age capitalism and, like the Standard Oil monopoly. Like, does the US just need to get rid of antitrust laws so it can have sufficiently large mega corporations that can drive down costs, do American involution, and compete with China? I have not thought this out whatsoever, but just as a little spark that came to my mind. You can dodge that or jump that question if you want.
I actually like that question because it's like a finer point about how to manage the market. I think antitrust is a really interesting case where um, we're actually very okay with that. In fact, there's despite sort of like the market idealism that perhaps might permeate a lot of American cultural thinking, I think a lot of Americans also are wary of monopolies and so like trying to find that balance. That's the thing. I think China's grappling with this too. They're always trying to find that balance between monopolies and having a really fragmented industry where everyone's just pouring investment into building capacity and nobody's really investing in the long run in sort of like, technological innovation. Somewhere in the middle ground, you want to have maybe enough players in the space that are legitimate, players, not just comfortable with their slice of the market, and you want them to be competing seriously, but you don't want like so much competition that none of them survive and the whole industry sort of fizzles out. So yeah, on the
Because
US side,
China thrives on scale, right? You look at the
yeah,
new
yeah, yeah.
BYD complex. You look at what Patrick McGee describes in sort of iPhone City, I think Shenzhen, like the dormitories, like 300,000 people in a factory assembling 1 million iPhones every day. Like, how does the West compete with that if we don't have like a massive sort of Standard Oil size monopoly that gets big enough and can mimic that scale? Maybe we'll park that there, but it's interesting. My mom has a book about the 1848 revolutions that rocked Europe. Many weren't successful at installing a new order, but they did modify and force some concessions and changes in terms of governance. In French Revolution, we can go all the way through it. Right now, as we talk about the sort of disease of stock buyback capitalism, where again, I'm being facetious here. Financial services are very important. Read Neil Ferguson's The Ascent of Money. I thought that was really useful.
Oh yeah,
Like
yeah.
we need these services, but they've sort of become malignant and metastatic, and we have this sort of casino, this essentially responsible for 20% of economic activity. There's huge political interests within that chunk of capital. If a system's not working, often it really leads to a kind of a crisis. It leads to I don't know about a revolution, but like, are we not going to need to sort of overthrow that interest? Because fundamentally, this is about where we put the capital. And if it's all just going into, not all of it, but you know what I mean? It's going into stock buybacks and these, whatever, fiber to cables to speed day trading or whatever, or minute trading or second trading, whatever it is. Like it seems like that kind of political reform revolution is going to be required. And I mean, Trump is supposed to be a drain the swamp candidate from outside the establishment. Like maybe these are early efforts or manifestations of a sort of disquiet with this kind of profoundly unfair system that's destroying the American working class and leading to crazy inequalities. I find it hard to imagine that a political leader would survive assassination if they actually went after the finance sector and tried to significantly modify American political economy. But maybe competing with China and increasingly sort of losing, as your essay posits, might stimulate some kind of a change there. I don't know. This is a really abstract, not even a question, but
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a really interesting one because it's like, is there a revolution underway in our minds, in our approach to thinking about these issues? And I feel like there is a partial revolution underway. The problem is that there's like multiple counter revolutions happening at the same time. So I actually am one of these people who subscribes to the theory that like the global financial crisis, which I feel like I came of age in, is the event that we're still sort of living in the shadows of. The like shock to jobs, to stability, to like the whole global system, it got brought into question from that, and I feel like we're still like figuring out what to do about that. And I tie a lot of trends these days back to that moment. And yeah, the question is like, what revolutions will happen? Like which of them will happen? I think Trump is kind of revolutionary in the sense of like how extreme he is in his approach, even just obviously like the kind of language that he uses and the way that people, Republicans, people who voted for him, even just sort of like broader discourse has changed because of just what he says. And so, yeah, I wonder if there's sort of like competing revolutions happening. There is a huge chunk of the country, United States, that is very, very concerned about, again, a lot of the issues that I was just talking about, and doesn't like the status quo with like buyback capitalism. So yeah, I don't know where we'll end up, but I think I think some bigger ideas are happening now that were, I think all the way back to when I was in college. Yes, reading Milton Friedman and soaked in sort of like the Chicago School of Economics, and it felt like back then there was just more of like a narrow way of thinking about what was possible, and now I think a broader range has opened up in many different directions.
I mean, I guess one of those political revolutions within the Republican side of politics is national conservatism. And maybe that's, when Trump appointed J.D. Vance, that seemed like it was a really strong signal. A lot within the many people within the Republican Party were like, what the fuck happened? Like, we were the party of neoliberalism, of free trade. This is bonkers. I don't know enough about national conservatism to understand whether or not it foresees a somewhat strong or muscular role for government. Probably does in terms of immigration enforcement, for instance, but whether in other areas it does as well. But again, that question of if it does, then do you have the competence within that political cadre who have just been hell bent on destroying government, on making it ineffective, to justify more and more privatization, et cetera. Maybe that's kind of an open question. We'll kind of leave that hanging in the ether. I'm not sure how much more time you have, but this has been an absolute pleasure, Kyle. One of my favorite interviews, and it's been 5 years. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and
Yeah.
really look forward to your book. Everyone should go subscribe immediately to High Capacity. We will link the New York Times op-ed, and yeah, looking forward to staying in touch.
Thank you, Chris. This is really, really fun. Thanks for having me on.
Today's episode was made possible through a generous donation from the Xerxes Foundation and from listeners like you making pledges on our Substack. If you'd like to join the tribe, please do head over to our Substack, smash that pledge button, or if you would like a tax-deductible receipt, you can hit the donate button and make a contribution through our fiscal sponsor. We genuinely appreciate your support. It is only through your generosity that we are able to continue to offer energy literacy on demand.